Welcome, everyone. Hi. We're thrilled to welcome you to this event, Sex Robots and Artificial Intimacy, Threat or the Next Best Thing, and to the online platforms of both TUE and Studium Generale. This event is presented by the Eindhoven University of Technology and organized by the Center for Humans in Technology in cooperation with Studium Generale. I'm also happy that so many people from all over the country and all over the world have registered for this event, and that the event can be part of the annual Dutch Technology Week, which is hosting exciting online events throughout the week. If you have any questions or comments for our speakers throughout the event, you can use the chat function on YouTube or the comments section on Facebook, and we'll make sure to include as many questions as we can in our discussion today. I'm Lily Frank, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Industrial Engineering and Innovation Science in the Philosophy and Ethics group here at TUE. Our university is now celebrating its 65th birthday, and we aim to produce socially engaged researchers and to train engineers to become thoughtful and ethical citizens who are driven by values as well as their scientific and technical curiosity. Next slide, please. As I said, the event is specifically hosted by the Center for Humans in Technology, which aims to foster and enhance high-quality, multidisciplinary scientific research at the intersection of humans and technology, and to translate fundamental research insights into viable applications, services, and policies. We aim to pursue three goals: to enhance technological developments by taking the human perspective into account in collaboration with the technological fields, to realize further synergy between humans and technology-related disciplines and foster human-centered and value-centered approaches to design, and to open up new opportunities for research funding with partners in the Brainport area and beyond. Next slide. So please follow us on Twitter and check out our website for future events. Next slide. This specific event focuses on intimacy, which includes much more than sex. Intimacy includes emotions like love, care, activities like affection and touch, shared experiences, and relationships like friendship, companionship, pleasurable connections with other human beings. Human infants, for example, do not develop properly without sufficient touch. And many psychologists have characterized solitary confinement for prisoners as a form of torture, just to give some examples of how important intimacy is. Next slide. Specifically, this event focuses on the connection between technology and intimacy. This is a subject which has garnered increasing academic and popular attention over the past 10 years, as suggested by the plethora of recent and forthcoming books on the topic shown here. Next slide. Technology is increasingly playing a role in some of the most personal and meaningful activities in our lives, mediating relationships, friendships, sexual relationships, and even love. What I'm trying to say is that this event is not just about high-tech vibrators, although that might be part of it. Intimate technologies have the potential to disrupt and transform how we relate to one another and how we think about ourselves in profound ways. My research, as well as others at TUE, and certainly the research of the speakers tonight, aims to critically interrogate the ethical and psychological impacts of these technologies, investigating their potential for improving human flourishing or hindering it. Next slide. Our two speakers tonight, I will just introduce in the next two slides. So Dr. Kate Devlin is a British computer scientist specializing in artificial intelligence and human-computer interaction, best known for her work on human sexuality and robotics. She was co-chair of the annual Love and Sex with Robots convention in 2016, held in London, and was founder of the UK's first ever sex tech hackathon, held in 2016 at Goldsmiths, University of London. She's senior lecturer in social and cultural artificial intelligence in the Department of Digital Humanities in King's College London, and is the author of Turned On: Science, Sex, and Robots. Next slide, please. Our next speaker, Professor Kathleen Richardson, is a social anthropologist and professor of ethics and culture of robots and AI at the School of Computer Science and Informatics at De Montfort University in the UK. An author of An Anthropology of Robots and AI, Annihilation, Anxiety, and Machines. In 2015, she, along with colleagues, launched the campaign against sex robots to draw attention to the problematic effects of new technologies on human relations and their potential to impact and to create new layers of inequality between men and women, and adults and children. She advocates for compassionate and violence-free technology based on a freedom ethic, and is critical of coercive and violent models of human life that are transferred to the making of new technologies. Her forthcoming book with Polity Press is titled Sex Robots: The End of Love. So the following, again, just to remind you, if you have any questions, please share them in the chat on Facebook or on YouTube, and we'll try to get to them. So first, we will hear from Dr. Devlin, and then we'll have a period of questions for her. And then we'll hear from Dr. Richardson, a period of questions for her, and then a broader discussion with the entire audience. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Devlin.
Hi, thank you very much indeed. Let me just share my screen. And I think you should be able to see my slides now. So I want to just start by talking about how this idea of creating artificial partners, of generating some kind of artificial intimacy, is actually, it's a really, really old thing. It's a really old trope. It's been around for a very long time. And this idea of creating some kind of artificial human, we can follow that right back into Greek myth, and even the creation of the first human, Pandora, who was almost created by a team of programmer gods and given the gift of intelligence. And the reason I like this particular depiction is because we see echoes of it in the sci-fi that we encounter today. Things like Maria the robot in Metropolis. And the portrayal of the fembot is a really interesting one, because they tend to be portrayed as either the femme fatale, who is going to rise up and overthrow usually the men, or as some kind of devoted, idealized girlfriend. And that femme fatale narrative is incredibly interesting, because the idea that a robot will shake off its programming, and in this case rise up, speaks to fears that the patriarchy has of women coming to disrupt things when they literally gain a mind of their own. So this is a very interesting thing to study and to look at. And then in the past few years, there have been companies, just a handful worldwide, that say that they are creating sex robots. And the definition is pretty narrow when these are talked about. And also there are none that are commercially available yet. So there is one prototype that you can pre-order. There are a few dead ends along the way, but they are not for sale. They are by no means a mass market thing, and I honestly don't think they ever will be. But they are a fascinating glimpse at one avenue where we could watch the development of artificial intimacy. I don't think it's the main avenue, but I think and I will touch on that later on, but I think it is an avenue that people expect, because they have been shown this from so many sci-fi films over the years. And the reason that it takes human form is because that is what we're used to seeing in these depictions down the years. So in the past sort of 5-6 years, we've seen lots of headlines about these developments, and they tend to be very sensationalist. Things like this one from the Express, which is probably the most egregious of the newspapers when it comes to these kind of headlines. End of sex. Scarily real sex robots to replace women as men can't tell the difference. And I do think this is perhaps a little unforgiving on the men. You can definitely tell the difference. And I also don't think that replacement is going to happen anytime soon. And so this is when this headline was written, and indeed still today, this is the height of sophistication of sex robots that we're seeing. So on the left, that's Roxy with a triple X. And Roxy was developed by a company called True Companion, Douglas Hines. Roxy doesn't exist, really. There are no sightings of Roxy, a developed model. This goes back to sort of 2010 when Roxy was unveiled at a trade show, but no one has ever reported actually owning one. There have been many headlines about Roxy in the past because, as well as being this incredibly reductive stereotype of a woman, Roxy also has various modes that she, and I'm gendering here for ease of conversation, that she or it was reported to have, such as a frigid mode, a mature mode, a young mode, a wild mode, all these different kind of ways that you can flip between certain characters to have this sex robot perform a particular gender role. This is something that is somewhat concerning. It's not particularly, imaginative. And I do think that there are some deeply problematic things there about objectification of women. But Roxy has never actually made it to market, so we can ignore Roxy for now. On the right-hand side is Samantha. Samantha was developed by Sergio Santos, an engineer basically working out of his own workshop at home in Spain. And Samantha was developed, he didn't develop the body, that is the body of a sex doll, but he developed the animatronics and the AI for it. And the idea was that Samantha would be a robot that you had to woo. So you had to, the nicer you were to Samantha, the more likely she was to respond nicely to you. And the aim was to please her sexually so that she could please you sexually. So he was trying to build in the idea of a reciprocal relationship between the user and the sex robot. And in the center is Harmony. Harmony is the most developed prototype that we see today, made by Abyss Creations, who make rail dolls. So this has come out of the lineage of the sex doll or the love doll. It's basically a doll that has an animatronic head and face and an AI personality that can also stand alone in app form. Now, none of these robots can really truly be described as robots. This is a shorthand way of referring to them. They are mostly dolls. They can't stand up on their own. They don't have any movement other than, in the case of Harmony, her head and some sensors that were in Samantha. Samantha's now stopped being built, so that she's out of the picture as well. So this is really just Harmony. And Abyss Creations, who make Harmony, have also made a male version, which I think we should best describe as a tokenistic attempt to redress the balance when people said, why are you just making these reductive female figures? And the answer is that these are all reductive female figures, mostly because they are being designed out of the lineage of the sex doll that is mostly bought by men, and that they are designed and marketed with that in mind. This is not some kind of well-researched, market-researched area. This is giving customers what the manufacturers think they want, which is to turn those dolls into more interactive forms. This is just some photographs of Harmony, so you can see that she has the servos and the wires that form her brain, as it were. But she can be controlled via a tablet, which has an interface on it that allows for interaction. And the machine learning, it's a conversational AI, it's a chatbot. It's actually, it's reasonably good for holding a conversation. This is a lot of craftsmanship that goes into these dolls. And so they are expensive. They are a very niche market. They are essentially a commodity, and a luxury commodity at that. So there are lots of sensationalist and scaremongering headlines that, when we start to dig behind it, the stories don't quite hold up. So this top one from Newsweek, that a futurist said, if you a hacked sex robot could murder people, security expert ones. The only way that any of these sex robots could murder people is if perhaps they were plugged into the mains and you tried to give them a bath or something like that. There is literally not any way of that being possible. These dolls cannot move their limbs. hacking is an issue if it's connected to Wi-Fi, but that's a whole different story. And the problem there is with data, not with causing physical harm. With the center headline, "Sex Robot Molested, Destroyed at Electronics Show," this was the Samantha robot that was put on display at an electronics show. Sergio Santos said to people, "You can't touch this doll." People did, and as thousands of people went through the trade show, it started to see damage. This was not sexually motivated damage. This was damage from people pushing, prodding, doing what people do when you tell them you can go ahead and touch this. But it was then turned into this idea of molestation, this media narrative which suggests that there is some problematic element here. Now, there are some problematic elements, but this is taking a story that is not particularly indicative of violence in a particular, in violence against women, and twisting it into it being that. And the community of doll owners massively reject that kind of portrayal. And I think that blaming and shifting blame onto consumers of sex dolls is really difficult. And I think it's centering on those kind of attacks and blaming the narratives for it echoes previous attacks on things like computer games, where it's said that they will cause an increase in violence. And the thousands of studies have never been able to actually affirm that in any way. The final story there, Gizmodo, "Sex Robots May Literally Fuck Us to Death." This came from the idea of AI out of control. And any piece of AI that doesn't properly follow what we intended to do because we have programmed it incorrectly will go on and on forever. It's the idea of Nick Bostrom's paperclip maximizer that turns everything in the universe into paperclips. So the issue there is that if we don't program technology correctly, then yes, it can be problematic. So all of these things do speak to certain truths, but those certain truths are not embedded in the idea of the sex robot. These are larger societal issues, and sex robots are a tiny aspect of that, and one that I think, as I said earlier, is quite a dead end. There were a few stories as well that perhaps what people who were violent towards women, and this includes incels, and incels involuntary celibate, they have murdered people in the name of their cause. They think that women owe them sex, and they feel that they can get away with violence if they don't have those needs met. And there were a few articles come out saying, well, what they need is sex robots. And I think this is just so utterly strange way of looking at things, because, you know, an incel, this is just weaponized misogyny, and you can't engineer that out by giving people a robot. Not only that, that would be rejected as well, because the main cause here for the incels is that women should, it's real women that should desire them. Anything else is seen as a cope. Anything else is seen as being not satisfactory. So this very idea that you can use sex robots as some kind of utopian vision of sex for everyone, I think is very problematic. Last year, a PhD student and I were doing some work around the people involved in creating sex robots, in particular the Harmony robots. We talked to doll owners and we talked to the creators as well, and we did some analysis on the advertising material too. And one of the owners said, the one message about love dolls I would love to get across is they're not just for sex. And I think this is where the intimacy part comes in, because some people do fetishize the dolls because they are dolls, and some people enjoy the sexual aspect of that. But many people buy the dolls for other reasons. Some people buy them so that they can pose them and model them and take pictures of them. They're for photography. Some of them collect them as if they're collector's items. And some live with them as if they are real life partners, and they give them backstories and they care for them and they look after them. And it is a very cherishing relationship for the men who do that. So the message that seemed to come out of that was, please don't use the term sex doll, because they are so much more. And the intimacy is a really key part. And when we did an analysis of the advertising, the emphasis on sex is very reduced. It's much more about companionship. And indeed, the things that are being offered via things like the AI interface, the AI conversational chatbot part of Harmony, is about companionship. It's companionship with a flirtatious edge or companionship with a sexual edge, but it hinges on that aspect of having this partner. This is an example of the Real Doll X, the app that you can buy for like $20 for your phone. And you can tweak this to your settings, and you can create your virtual girlfriend. Now, this is an avenue that I see as being much more likely than the avenue of the embodied sex robot. Sex robots, it's really hard to make robots, especially ones that resemble humans. It's technologically very difficult. It's computationally expensive. It's financially expensive. And really, it's not got a huge mass appeal. By contrast, this idea of conversational AI that you can form a bond with, that has much more appeal. And we've seen it in Japan with Gatebox, little holographic girlfriend, where people build up a bond and build up a relationship with these. And it's this, again, this sense of companionship and this sense of intimacy. Now, just before I move on to the next bit, I would say that opens up many, many questions about how we form intimate bonds with machines. I think we're seeing the emergence of a new social category. And I think that this is not an illusion. This is not a delusion. We are not saying this is a real substitute for a real thing. I think that people are seeing it as acknowledging that this is a piece of technology, but choosing to engage with it, almost in a fictional way, in the way that we engage with books and with film. And people get very invested in those. And we only have to look at things like fanfic to see how invested people get with characters in fiction. So I think there is a fiction that builds up around this. No one's actually being deluded here that this is anything real. People want it to be real, and that's where it differs. Is that a damaging thing? That depends. If it is causing problems in someone's life to the point where they are making themselves unhappy or it is affecting their everyday well-being, then yes, this could be problematic. But if it's not, then I don't feel that I should be the person who judges any kind of bond forming with a piece of technology. So I think we're at the stage now where we start to look at those barriers and those bonds and those boundaries and find out, you know, what exactly is happening here? How can we understand this sociality between us and these embodied machines that are conversationally like humans? So I think I would like to reject the sex robots in their reductive, stereotypical female form. I think they aren't a good solution to anything. I think that some people will want those, but it's a very small market. And I think we can do better. And back in 2016 and again in 2017, we ran Sex Tech Hack, which looked at that. How can we create intimacy through technology that's not just about sex, not just about penetrative sex, it's not just about gendered roles. How can we explore how technology can not just relationships with us and the technology, but mediate relationships between humans as well? And for me, that's the big thing. Can we use the technology as a mediation for our own human relationships? Which I strongly believe we can. I think we can get a lot out of technology in that format. And we saw some amazing examples. We saw people creating all kinds of things that will hug you, things that will alert you to what your partner is doing, things that can be controlled by someone else, things that are more like your stereotypical sex toys, like vibrators, like artificial vaginas. So there's a really broad mix, and there's a lot of really good ideas out there. And I think when we start looking down that avenue instead, because if we consider how we've been in the pandemic, the one thing that a lot of people have wanted to do is just hug someone over the internet. And if I could make a machine that would hug people over the internet, you know, it would be wonderful. I would really love that. So intimacy doesn't have to take the form of a Barbie doll-esque robot that talks dirty to you. And I think that we will limit ourselves massively by sticking to that route, and that we should shake things up, and that we should form new narratives about what these things look like. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate. So I think we are just starting to get some questions from the audience, but maybe I can start out by asking you about some of the comments you made in your talk, which triggered my thinking. So you mentioned that compositional AI that you can form a bond with is much more likely to be the future of of intimacy with artificial agents. And you said that one of the problems with that might be that it harms those individuals, right?
Well, one of the problems would be that we don't know yet if there will be harm. So,
right, okay. And maybe I also forgot to mention this. I think that we might be having a small problem with your microphone. It might just be that you have the microphone on your computer on as well.
Are you hearing some background noise?
I think that's the idea. There's some white noise.
It's because it's the laptop fan. I can't do anything about that, okay. I'm afraid.
Okay, well, no worries. Yeah. So we don't know, I suppose, how these relationships with compositional AI will impact relationships in general, our self-perception, etc. So how do you think that designers should approach that issue? So if I'm someone who's creating these things, right, I'm simply filling maybe like a market need, or should I think about particular values when I'm designing them?
I think if I had my way, then all tech would be designed thinking about values, but we know that that's utopian and we're not going to get that. I would like to see people make a stance towards ethical development. I think everyone wants that, but it doesn't always go that way in practice. A lot more research is needed into the way that we build rapport with machines. We know there's countless articles already about things like the early conversational bots like Eliza, where people were really quick to form a bond and to confide in a machine that didn't even have any AI in it. It's just matching words, but prompting people to engage. So we know that we treat technology socially with that sociality in mind. But we need to work out as that gets more and more, progresses more and more towards almost seamless conversation. We're not there yet, but GPT-3 means that it's getting better. How are people interacting? If you look at the rise in voice assistants over the past 5 years or so, people very naturally talk to their voice assistants because that's what we do naturally is conversation. And those are really just search engines with a voice. They can't hold conversations the way that the chatbots can. So I think there's a lot there that we can start investigating. And when I said it's about, could they do harm? We don't know. With anything, with any piece of technology, with anything at all, if things start to impact your own well-being, then perhaps that is harmful. But we don't know if that will. We don't really know at what point that becomes problematic. If you look at people playing video games, for example, some people will stay on too long. Their home lives will start to suffer a bit. I love to use the word addiction. I think because it has more of a clinical thing, but we know that some people cannot moderate as well with technology. And my fear would be that what happens if people become over-reliant to the point of detriment to themselves. But what is that point? And should we even morally begin to police that? That's another question.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. So the question suggests, well, we live in such an overstimulated consumerist world, and technology seems to market itself to every human impulse. If sex robots are kind of on one margin of an extreme way of fulfilling our human impulses, should that be a limit? That's the question. I'm rephrasing.
Should there be a limit to
the extent to which we use technology to, I suppose, fulfill our impulses?
So again, it's about where does harm come in, and you can position yourself along that continuum, at various points. And I'm of the belief that people can choose to have these interactions if they want to, and I don't feel that I should be judging someone for their whatever they want to indulge their impulses, provided it's not harming anyone else and it's not harming themselves. So I think to say, if this is a question about regulation, I think that's a really difficult thing. Regulation as it stands is really difficult in tech. The technology moves far too fast. So I don't think we can make regulations around specific items of technology, specific things of technology, we can make it around the harms that they cause, perhaps. But to say that because the minute you make a law about a specific piece of technology, that law is outdated. And I'm much more inclined to be evidence-based for this and say, wait until we have in-depth studies before we start trying to regulate.
That's clear. Thank you. So let's just virtually thank Dr. Devlin. And now I would like to turn the floor over to Professor Richardson.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm going to share my screen, and you might hear a cat in the background that wants to be let out, but they're going to have to sit through the rest of our event. Right, can you see this screen here? Yep. Okay, good. So first of all, I've got a disclaimer here. This presentation has pornographic images. So if you feel that you'll be offended by these pornographic images or any of the content related to pornography, you might want to leave now. Certainly if there are children around, you don't really want them to be present. And the images I've used, I've not doctored any of the images or the stories. I presented them to you as I found them. So for anyone who'd like to opt out, now is your chance. Okay, for those who are staying. So thank you very much for this invitation to participate in this event. Thank you to Lily, who invited me. And I think Lily and I share very different viewpoints, but I really appreciate that Lily extended this invitation to me in the spirit of dialogue and debate, and also to Mark in the background, who helped with all the arrangements, and Mark too, of course. And I also want to say it's really great to be part of Dutch Technology Week, because I really love the Netherlands. I've spent a lot of time in Tilburg, and I've been to the University of Leiden for 3 weeks during my undergraduate degree. So it's one of my favorite countries, and so it's really great to be here and participate in this event. Right, well, let's get to it. So I'm going to have a very different tack to what you've heard there. So let's just look at this: sex, robots, and artificial intimacy, a threat or the next best thing. Some of the ideas I'm going to present to you tonight are ideas that I've developed, and they're going to be in my book. So really, I'm just giving you a very small snapshot of some of the ideas that I've been developing there. And hopefully it will be out in 2022. I was hoping to get it out this year, so it'd mark the 100th anniversary of Karel Čapek's robot, his play Rossum's Universal Robots, but alas, hopefully it will be next year. So there is the cat. Right, so what I found really interesting about this event was the image that accompanied it. And I want people to view this image very seriously, because this is going to be the first point of call for many people who are going to sign up and participate. And what it features is a woman hanging out with a sex doll, wearing similar clothes. For some reason, the doll's got its hand in the bag. I mean, how did that happen? So everything about it has been staged, like there's 2 beers. I'm thinking, is this really intimacy? What's going on? It's like, have I entered another dimension? Because, I mean, one of them, the woman is eating crisps, so the doll can't eat because it doesn't have a digestive system. So I'm thinking, well, how is intimacy going to be cultivated here? Maybe she's going to mush up the crisps and put the crisps in the doll's mouth. And then I'm thinking, well, as it doesn't have a digestive system, then the crisps are just going to sit there at the back of the plastic rubber throat. And, if you're not too careful, it's going to start rotting after a while. So it's like, what's going on here? What's this propaganda about intimacy that's being presented in this image? And through particularly academic narratives, and we've just heard a series of arguments about how you can have relationships with machines and they can become your companions, and we're going to have this wonderful intimacy, and we're on the threshold of these new kinds of relations. And this is what's going on in academia. This is like they're trying to move the, if you like, the framing of these objects away from what we all know they're really about into these other areas. And I think that does serve an important purpose. But tonight, I'm just going to focus on the sex bit about that purpose. So that's the kind of academic presentation. And this is actually what you find when this is the production and the consumption of these objects. They're in the form of girls, of infants even, of women. They're highly pornographic. They are in pornography. There's a branch of pornography, they're like prostituted women. You can go and visit and use one in a brothel. So this is actually what's happening at the level of production and consumption. And this fantastic idea that we've just seen about sharing a beer and a packet of crisps with a plastic doll is quite extreme, really, when you think about it. So what's going on here? Now, in my book, I do a critical analysis of many terms, but the term that I'm going to do a critical analysis on tonight, which I think is important for this debate, is the idea of a sex robot. And like radical feminists, we often find, not only radical feminists, but anthropologists, Marxists, often find that they inherit terms in the culture that they're in. So they have to do a critical study on the terms. Is the term accurate? And if you think about it, we kind of inherited a term sex robot from David Levy and people like him. It shouldn't be a term that we're actually taking forward. And I hope I can persuade you in the audience, or maybe viewers of this video later on, to stop using this term. And there's no love, there's no sex, and there's no relationship with a robot, but there's definitely no sex. So why is there no sex? It doesn't have a sex body, it's not capable of reproduction, sensuousness, doesn't have consciousness, cannot participate in intimacy. It's not capable of participating in any sexual activity. There's no relationality and no capacity for love. All these aspects are absent. It's an object. That's actually all that it is. But the object, if you think about a synecdoche, and I hope I've got that word correct, it's a part that stands in for the whole. So I'm looking at these objects as parts that stand in for the whole. So what's going on? What are they representing? And I think the most accurate term for them are porn bots. They're actually pornography. What these men are creating is their own version of pornography that they can take home with them. And what the dolls are representing are the women in the pornography. And they're having their own version that they can have around the house and put in, one of the character on the top left here, he's actually putting his porn bots at the breakfast table with his children, taking his pornography on the school run with him. So, and the thing about pornography, especially if you can start scripting, the pornography can become even more elaborated, because you can start scripting it in particular kind of ways. You can start putting words inside the pornography, and then you can echo those words back to you, so you can get a more richer, fuller experience from the pornography. And of course, when we look at the children, the representations, okay, these are mimicking children, infants, normally girls. These are porn dolls and porn bots. Now, interestingly, with the girls is in the ones that look like children, is that the advocates of porn bots can't say all the things that they say of the adult ones, that they should have more body types or colors. The ones of children, they actually have to frame it in another language. They have to couch it in a therapeutic language on the one hand and a kind of fictional language on the other. So the therapeutic language is profoundly important, and they have to present these kinds of objects as therapeutic. But they're actually pornography. What they're doing is they're giving the men who, because of legality, actually, because of like conventions we have and legal rules that prohibit adult relations with children, they're giving men an approximate version of abuse. And it's framed, the problems with the therapeutic language is that when anything's presented in robotics and AI, especially in therapeutic terms, then the funders become very interesting, and the claims about it that it could have some socially beneficial aspect become heightened and amplified. And I think we should be very concerned about this, because what these dolls are actually giving those men is an approximate version of child abuse. That's all that it's doing. There goes the Countessa. So what is porn? And I want you to stop thinking about porn dolls and porn robots as particularly porn bots, because people think like somehow they're, they're kind of representations of us, that we are somehow making these objects that can resemble and mimic us as human beings, which is, porn bots are basically elaborated puppets. They always have been and they always will be. What they really are, and the connection to pornography, is best understood by going back to ancient Greek philosophy. So in ancient Greek society, you had men like philosophers like Aristotle that raped the slaves and raped children and raped the women in prostitution, and basically wanted those memories, if you like. A colleague of mine called them souvenirs. They wanted the souvenirs of those rapes. And so they painted these images on pots. They painted the images of those rapes. So in the direct and proximate relations of Greek men with those other human beings in that society, and you've got to remember, their voices were the ones that were amplified. It wasn't the slaves or the pawns or the children that had their voice inflected in that culture. It was the master's voice being inflected over and over again. So what they are, the porn bot allows this approximated version, like a souvenir of abuse, and an opportunity to have a version of the pornography that they can make use of. And what I've noticed as well is that many journalists are interviewing these men who have porn dolls, and they're not asking them about their pornography use, as if they're all like stroking their hair and bathing them, at bedtime. Even just asking the question, are you using these alongside pornography, is an oversight on the vast majority of people who seem to have done any research on this topic. But that's a question that we need to ask and need to be answered, because they are pornography. And by all accounts, the men who have disclosed how they use porn bots and porn dolls, they are using them alongside other pornographic forms, even visiting prostituted people. So I don't have time in this talk to address other issues like relationality, loving, or therapeutic robots, which are basically an outcome of a particular worldview of relationship that is not about mutuality, it's not about love, it's not about connection. And therefore the template that's being used is more like this rapist, this philosophical rape patriarchy template is the one that's being applied. Because if you believed in relationality and love, you cannot have relationality and love outside of mutuality, unless you have a version of it that is tied closely to abuse and rape and extreme forms of violence. You have to buy my book to find out more. So what is this? What's going on at the level of being? At the level of being, there is an annihilation of women taking place. There are murders of women. There is femicide, where they are being aborted as fetuses because of their female sex. They are being sold into slavery. They are experiencing domestic violence. So there's 3.5 billion women in the world, and I tell you, there's 3.5 billion stories of sexual violence that they experience. But, without going into the actual, this is the economy. What I'm trying to do here is connect up back the economy, the direct proximate experiences. And yes, it is mediated through pornography, but that kind of hatred and desire to annihilate women or see them as objects is what's being circulated and perpetrated through these ideas about porn bots. And it goes on and on and on and on. And I literally could have had hundreds of pages of story after story of little girls being raped, or rape being decriminalized effectively, or mail order brides, or migrant women who are trafficked from Nigeria with the promise of, a job in Western Europe, or the brothels in Europe, where basically you pay to abuse women on a regular basis. And just hundreds of story over and over again. At the direct and level, there's real abuse taking place of women. And that's what we need to start connecting up with, how these representations in pornography, these representations in prostitution, and of course then these approximated versions, these imaginary forms that are developing. Because there is no such thing as an object that can think, feel, relate, have sex. That is a fantasy. If you want to know why, I've got an explanation in my book. I want to just end on a couple more slides. One's about Catherine McKinnon. And basically, she made a really important point. She's, as far as I'm concerned, from the 1980s onwards, just at the moment when women start to enter academic and social life, you know, based on these humanist principles, we decide to take a postmodern turn. And it's this postmodern turn, really, that we're in, where we're thinking, oh, we can have relations with objects, you know, that we're all cyborgs now. And I'll read out this quote. Beginning in the early 1970s, direct engagement with the social reality, not reality in the abstract, this reality in the broken down, immediate, socially lived out, concrete, exposed the regularities and widespread extent and trauma of sexual abuse in childhood, the pervasiveness of rape and other sexual assault, the torture and the shame of battering, the routine existence of sexual harassment at home, in school and on the street, and the endemic abuse constituted by pornography and prostitution. This hasn't gone away. If anything, what's happened is the internet giving more and more options to become a pornographer, putting more and more opportunities in the hands of abusers, alongside the vast production of pornography today, means this is at a crisis levels. We should have been solving these problems and dealing with these problems, but instead now we're fighting, you know, these new versions, these new elaborations on the same old misogyny and annihilation of women. And actually, Kate mentioned there was not everything. I didn't disagree with everything Kate said, but she talked about, you know, incels not wanting them. There's a vast, that, you know, there is a population of men in China now who are calling on the arguments that they should be given these porn dolls because actually in their country they murdered, I think it's 43 million missing females. So you've got vast proportion. In Japan, the same is happening. In America, there is a growing cultural movement where men are not having relations, and they're actually calling for the annihilation of women, not for the abolition of pornography, I may add. They still want pornography. They still want a sex industry, but alongside that, you know, they want these objects. They want them to be more of their world. So this idea that there's some liberating foundation to them is very problematic. So my politics, my political academic action here, my politics is a response to Aristotle's politics. Stop using the term sex in relation to them. They're porn bots, porn dolls, child abuse porn bots. But that doesn't mean that if you start calling them intimacy bots or companion bots, that they're those things. They're neither those things either, because they are not capable of mutuality. And if you don't have basically an idea of mutuality, then all you're doing is you're articulating this the kind of patriarchal slavers point of view, the kind of rape point of view. I think mainstream academics are captured by this rape industry and promoting it more widely. It needs critical academics to speak up and be countered. And I wonder to what extent the advocates of these porn bots are actually users of pornography. So what they're actually doing, they're users of it. They're not disclosing actually they're users of it. And then they're promoting these pornographic worldviews more widely. And you know, if I ever did a survey of academics, that would be a very interesting thing to find out. So, you know, I think it's the same if you have judges who are viewing pornography, extreme BDSM pornography, and then one of their victims in the court is someone who was caused death by choking. Are we really to assume that that judge in that situation can be objective, can have sympathy or empathy for the woman? And I think there's lots of issues like that. We certainly find these patterns where people in positions of power are also the ones accessing the pornography, the child abuse imagery, or visiting the prostituted women or men for that matter. And anyway, more of this is in my book. And just one last thing. So in light of this new information, we've actually changed the name of the campaign against sex robots, and it's now the campaign against porn robots. That's because we have to refocus this attention away from this idea that these are anything other than pornography. They're mimicking the pornography on the pots that the slavers used after their souvenirs of the rapes that they carried out on the slaves and their wives and the children in that society. And on that note, I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. A very stimulating talk. I kept wondering if that was your cat meowing or my cat meowing.
She's on the table now, but so she wants to come in, out, in, out.
So first I want to mention the photograph that you brought up, which we used to promote the event, which is by this photographer, this artist, Hanneke Wetzer, who I think very much intended to raise the kinds of questions that you're raising. So she lived with this doll for a year during lockdown. And she's written some reflections on what it was like to have this kind of artificial intimacy with this object. I thought it was very interesting how you brought that into the discussion. So we have quite a lot of questions from the audience from you, maybe a couple of minutes. So one person in the audience asks you, why would you describe the use of these dolls or robots as the end of love? My life has never been so complete as it has since I started living with a doll. You either get it or you don't, he remarks. So that's more of a comment than a question, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to respond to that.
What can you say, really? I mean, I could say, I want to, I don't know. I could say my cat, the Countessa, loves me more than anybody else in the world, and my life is radically transformed. But to be honest, she doesn't really get much of a say in it, because what's happening, this is not a relationship, because a relationship is not one party narrating the relationship for both parties. A relationship involves opportunities of mutuality, participation, reflection, rejection even. And so when someone has more power, and you have incredible amount of power over an object, because, well, the object can't disagree with you, then actually all you're doing is you're narrating your own point of view. That's all you can narrate. So I wouldn't call that a relationship. And in fact, I think that's a very disturbing idea of a relationship, because that is the relationship. That is the kind of thinking. I'm not saying what you're doing with your doll is this, but that's the kind of thinking that underpins rape, abuse, domestic violence, that egocentric point of view.
Thank you. So another person asks, let's see. So they're specifically asking about child pornography and child porn dolls. So they say clearly there's illegality involved in child pornography, but where is the crime? I suppose we could also extrapolate, where is the moral wrongdoing in what you describe as child porn dolls?
Well, I think, thank you for your questions, by the way. What I tried to demonstrate was actually, even if you have a picture on a pot, it's not just fantasy, right? The picture on the pot actually represented what was going on at the level of experience in that society. Those men were going into brothels, and they were raping the prostitutes, they were raping the children, and then they were featuring those rapes on pots, and they were presenting it, passing it off as sex, right? So the fact that we've got child abuse porn bots, and, well, porn dolls, not porn bots, tells us that at the direct proximate level of experience, there is real abuse of children taking place, right? So the ideal situation, some people want to have the kind of direct proximate experience of abuse, but in the absence of that, then actually these approximated versions will do. But they are they are approximated versions of real abuse, which is why everyone who's found with a child abuse porn doll also has abuse imagery, because all they're part of their repertoire of pornography. And that's why that's why it's so important that it's framed as a fantasy, a split off world where, it's got no relation to the kind of material, economic, social conditions in which people live. It's very important that the establishment, if you like, perpetuate that idea. So that's why they talk about virtuality as being outside and disconnected from social relations. It's not. It's actually an approximated version of those direct social relations and abuses that take place. So basically, you're just giving a paedophile some pornography when you give him a porn doll of a child. That's what you're doing. And it's disturbing that then that's presented as potentially therapeutic.
So I think to stay on schedule, thank you for your answers. I think to stay on schedule, we will now shift to a discussion that includes both Kate and Kathleen, if that's okay with everyone. And we certainly have a lot of questions from the audience. So maybe we could start. I think in a few places, perhaps Kathleen directly disagreed with some of the things that you said, Kate. So would you like to respond to any of her comments, or should I just start in with questions from the audience for you both?
No, I'm happy with questions. That's fine.
Okay, great. So this would be a question for both of you. If you'd see any potential therapeutic uses for, let's say, sex bots, porn bots, depending on how we want to characterize them. Since there are some sex therapists and clinical psychologists who seem to recommend using them in clinical practice.
I think that sex tech in general has the potential to have therapeutic uses. And in fact, there are sex tech companies here in the UK who have created sex toys that can be used therapeutically. There was one company that created what they call a vibrator for someone with spinal cord injuries. And that meant that someone was able to achieve orgasm where normally they would not have been able to. So I think that speaks to the physiological side of it. And perhaps, I mean, I'm not a sex therapist, so I don't know if that is a thing that would be useful. But if sex therapists think that it would be useful, then perhaps there is indeed a place for that kind of thing. But certainly sex tech more broadly can be used in a therapeutic way.
Yeah, thank you. And do you see a big distinction between so like something like a vibrator or whatever it might be, and something that's meant to reflect the overall image of a human being?
Well, yeah. So the initially with sex toys, they began as genital replicas, and that's why we see, going back thousands of years, we see the use of things like dildos, for example, and they take a phallic form. And over the years, most recently in the past sort of 20, 30 years, those have started to become abstracted. And there's a number of reasons for this. One of them was that in Japan, where these some of the sex toys, like the rabbit vibrator, originated, there was an obscenity law that said that people couldn't create genital replicas. So they started to abstract them into more amorphous design, some things that went away from looking exactly like human body parts. And so now we have this wonderful array of very, very different ornaments, almost in some cases, sex toys that don't necessarily resemble any part of a human's anatomy. And then by contrast, you have things like the current prototype of a sex robot. And yeah, I think there is a difference there. And I think that there's definitely, this is one of the reasons why I think we should move away from that. I don't think it's a particularly useful thing to have that whole human form. Does it have a particular relevance, that human form? Yes, I think there is definitely a sense of engaging with a person when it's in that form, of building that rapport more easily, because we know that any machine where we have some degree of animism in it, it's more likely for us to treat it socially. So I think that there is that element to it there. But again, I think that this is something we can move away from.
Yeah.
Kathleen.
So Can I just say on animism, things don't need to have any form at all. They don't even need to move. I mean, as an anthropologist, there's animistic beliefs for mountains which don't move. So actually, animism, I think the ancestry of artificial intelligence and robotics is a fusion between slavery and mysticism about slavery. But again, I don't want to start going into other subjects in the book. Let's talk about the vibrator, because I think it's a very interesting comparison study. So the vibrator was invented by men who came up with this bogus idea that women had hysteria, because
that's a myth. That's a complete myth.
No, let me finish. And because in that society, the fact that women were depressed and they were not interested in sleeping with the men wasn't something that they wanted to basically acknowledge, right? So they wanted to create a system of ideas in order to basically deflect the attention away from an awful patriarchal culture in which women lived and were depressed. Quite naturally, living under patriarchy can be very depressing at times. So they pathologized it. They created a system of ideas and pathologized what the women were actually experiencing. Now, in that, they came up with this bogus solution to it, which is stimulating the clitoris in order to produce an orgasm. So there's lots of ideas that went into the vibrator, but actually the vibrator is none of those things, right? The vibrator is merely simulates the mechanism, if you like, of rubbing the clitoris. That's all it does. There's no agency. It doesn't have any grand philosophy. It's not an object that can determine relations in society. All it's doing is basically mimicking that experience. And as human beings, we want to create objects to maybe mimic experiences. But the porn doll and the porn bot is something else. What that's actually mimicking is this a very annihilating idea of the female human being. And that is what's being reproduced and circulated through these objects. And that, you know, why, if men wanted to have a stimulating sex aid, they could create a small device and put it on their penis that was shaped, you know, it had a kind of covering shape so they can insert it into it. Why did it have to come with a fully three-dimensional, fully fledged form with apps included that you can download, you know, that you can choose the body side, that you can choose the hair color to put on these dolls, the breast size, etc. This is an elaboration of something else.
Okay, I think they have also created those devices, though I believe.
The vibrator was not designed to cure hysteria. That is that's a common misconception.
Kate,
there's absolutely no evidence for that, and in fact, there's been 2 recent debunkings of that.
Yes, I've read them too. Thanks, Kate.
Yes, okay, exactly. So you'll know that there's no evidence.
No. I think you should go back and read some of your psychology of the period, because at the time there was a very dominant idea that women who express psychological, if you like, disorders, their reasonings was tied to their sexual dysfunction and their female sex. Yes, and I think if you go back in time, you will find this, and it's rooted in Freudian psychology and 19th century sexology. Read some good radical feminists might be good.
If you read Dr. Granville's patent about the invention of the electro vibrator, you'll see that there's absolutely no mention of that whatsoever. This was something that the doctor,
as if he's going to say that. I mean, you know, have you ever read a patent? They're not going to say, right, this patent is developed for this. It's like it has 3 dimensions. It's shaped like a cube. I mean, that's what happens in patents. Anyway, he marketed it as a commercial commodity. So he did. Vibrators never had any medicalized importance, and they are demedicalized today. So people can reinvent them and repurpose them as objects. There's nothing in the object that makes it anything other than an object that vibrates, that you rub on your genitals.
Yeah, I don't think anyone has said that there is. I think we're stuck on the same side here. I'm also saying that it's just a body part shaped thing that you can rub on your genitals. Absolutely. It's different from the idea.
You're excluding the history of the kind of analysis of women's subordination, whereas I'm including it.
No, and I'm telling you that has been debunked, this idea of the
You're telling me what? From one study? So I think you should go and read. Anyway, we're going to agree. I'm not going to agree, because I think there's plenty of evidence that look at the psychological sciences and the role of hysteria in basically psychologizing women's behavior under patriarchy.
So even if we set the history aside, I think the question would still have significance about whether there's a special moral category of evaluation or a special lens through which we should look at full-on body, person-shaped things versus devices that are meant to stimulate the genitals in a particular way. We could put those in two different buckets.
But it's not person, is it? It's not person, it's woman. It's women and girls. It's not person, it's not men and boys, it's women and girls. 99.9% of these objects are women, mimicking women and girls, because that's what's going on. Women and girls are being raped. Women and girls are being tortured. Women and girls are being abused. Women and girls are being, you know, image-based revenge uploaded into pornography sites. It's happening to women and girls, and that's why they're produced in the way they are.
So I think that we should take another question from the audience. There's clearly some differences on the relationship between gender-based violence and the use of these technologies, I think, between our two speakers and their understanding of the correlation and the relationship between these two sets of phenomena. I think that's fairly clear. So this is a slightly broader question. So someone asks, on an ethical level, to what extent does the gendering of companionship in technology change or impact social dynamics? And they say, I'm thinking about the so-called smart wives and female gendered home assistive technologies. So considering the ethics of those dynamics.
I think it's a very problematic area, and we know that all of the voice assistants started off with female voices as default, and those were we see this happening a lot with the female voice seen as a subservient thing and the male voice seen as an authoritative thing when it comes to technology. And I do think that's incredibly problematic. And now there's a few of those have introduced the ability to have a range of different voices and accents that you can give to your voice assistant. But again, this is something that did not have to be this way. It is that way. It reflects the bias that's in Silicon Valley. It reflects the bias that's in society. But we can shake that up and we can change that narrative, and we can make technology that doesn't follow that pattern. Even something as simple, someone once suggested in a talk I gave about this, said, why not have the voice assistant respond with just a completely different voice every time? Why not? I mean, you could have anyone's voice responding then. Shake it up. It doesn't have to be the same voice every time. It doesn't have to be in that gendered pattern. But yes, it is very gendered, and it's reflective of the problem in Silicon Valley.
So you think it's an issue about who's making the tech primarily?
Absolutely. It's more systemic than that, but that's a key part of it, definitely.
There's also a racial component there, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Did you want to respond to that question, Kathleen?
I do think, you know, the thing about the objects, because the designers have one idea about the object, and, you know, the reality is the designers may have an idea, but it may not be accurate. So there's a lot of inaccuracy presented. So designers, male designers, can have an idea that women are subordinate, right? And or lack humanity, or can be ushered in, if you like. These devices can be generalized because people accept them more if they feel like they're harmless. And I've got a good analogy with when I started my field work, and even today, you know, when you go to robotics labs, you find that all the robots look like children. And I remember one of the early professors telling me why they were designing their robots in their labs to look like children, because they wanted them to do work, right? So actually they were creating mimicking children to do child labor. But the reason why they did it is they said, well, Terminator has all these distressing images of robots. So we know we couldn't build this kind of adult version of what we wanted. We had to create a more pacifying object. So I think there's a lot of an idea, probably a wrong idea, but I think that underpins it, that somehow they can usher in these devices into our home as long as we feel less threatened by them. I don't think that's the whole story, but you're going to have to read my book for more on that.
Thanks. So zooming out a bit, beyond just sexuality, how do both speakers think about other forms of technologically mediated intimacy? So, for example, mediated non-sexual touch, like technology for hugging or squeezing through haptic technology, for example, or virtual reality or that kind of thing. Do you think that the sexual domain should be cordoned off, or are there also significant ethical considerations that apply to other forms of touch?
I think the development, because Kate made an interesting analogy in her talk with all these headlines. One I read recently was sex robot so lifelike and it breathes like a woman. It's kind of, it sounds like a kind of fantastic idea, but then you read some academic narratives of sex porn bots, and then you think, oh, actually the Daily Star and academics, they might have something in common. But I think I think with the objects themselves, they are, I've lost my train of thought. What was the question?
It's about other forms of mediated touch that are not sexual.
I think at the level of direct and proximate experience, there is intimacy, there is relationship, there is love, there is kindness, there is empathy. I do not think so if two people have that at a direct and proximate way, then they can use devices like this one we're using now to engage with each other. But they can't have it with an object. And actually, they can't have it outside of a relationship with another person. I think you do actually need to be in a proximate, direct relationship with other beings to be in relationship.
I think that we can form really intense relationships mediated by technology, and people do it all the time. And you can, especially when you're talking to someone, the power of exchanging messages is really, really strong. There's a lot of people who have met partners online and have exchanged messages online and have fallen in love with people online, and had very strong feelings. And I'm not going to negate those feelings at all, because they are intense and they are meaningful to the people involved. So I think it is possible. In terms of touch and mediated by technology, it would be, haptics are very expensive. It's difficult to do, and virtual reality tries very hard to do that and hasn't got there yet. It would be lovely if we could, and that's not just sexual touch, but any kind of touch where we would be able to do that. So I wouldn't rule out technology. I don't think that I think that we can mediate our relationships via technology, and I think it's been really, really important in the last year that we are able to do that, and that we maintain relationships and intimacy via the technology that we have. So I'm very much in favour of trying to replicate feelings of closeness and feelings of intimacy via technology.
Yeah, I think some of this idea that people are meeting online is widely exaggerated. I mean, something like Tinder is more like, a casual sex app. And there was a dating app, a marriage dating app, and I can't remember the story behind it, but they disclosed who the users were. And it turned out that 90% of the users were male users. But they'd been marketing the app to the male users as having this unlimited supply of female participants. So I think there's a lot of delusion. I think we have to be very critical of what we think is going on in these digital sex tech areas and industries.
I mean, I'm not sure that, as I said, dating app is necessarily what I was talking about. I think that dating apps do play a role in bringing people together to meet up, whether that's for a hookup or it's for a dating or it's for a relationship. But more broadly, the amount of people who have formed strong bonds via communities online, if we look at how intense that can be, I don't think we can rule that out as being something that isn't significant, because many of us have formed intense friendships with people online that spill into real life subsequently.
If they spill into real life, Kate, I don't have a problem. The point is by saying that you can live online and have relationships with people who you'll never meet. And I think at the level of being, you've got to have direct, proximate relationships with people. Those are what people need in their lives. And I think some of this narrative is actually saying it's supposedly very generous towards people who want to live with dolls and can't make partners. But actually, it's like we've given up on those human beings. We've said, look, this is the best you're going to get, right? A doll or an app or, some other mimicking puppet. Because for some reason we've given up on what we are as human beings and what we can do for each other and how we can help each other and show each other's love and kindness. And, this is what I think we could be doing more of, rather than investing all our resources into these mimicking artificial technologies.
So just to clarify, because to some extent it seems like you were talking past each other a bit. So I thought that Kate was talking about technology mediating to human beings who want to connect, but say they live on other sides of the world or something like that. That's significantly different from having a relationship with an avatar or a computer program like in the movie Her or something like that, right? So,
but I think it's also, if you're on other sides of the world, different from having direct and proximate experiences with something in your proximity. I think in your proximity is where your true relations lie.
So I disagree with that. I don't think that proximity is necessarily the factor there. I know there are people that I know online who've supported me through major life changes that I will never meet in person because they live in a whole different continent, yet would always be there for them in the middle of the night to talk to if they needed me. And I think that, that's something I would do for my friends in real life too. So I don't see that being an actual board, like some kind of block to having that intimacy and closeness.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like, if you like, the dissolution of intimacy, what is being described here. Because if you look at some sociological accounts of this, like Bauham Liquid Life, the kind of strong bonds that people would have, where they would be in proximate relations, they would spend time together, they would share ideas, they would help each other out in a crisis, they would form associations to create unions or other kinds of entities. That started collapsing almost as it started. But what we kind of are left with is this liquid life where you're saying that someone you've never met in the world who just happens to be on the phone at 3 o'clock in the morning is as meaningful to you in your life as someone who you have a close and direct partnership. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Right. Okay.
okay, so maybe we'll move on to another question, because these are clearly two very different intuitions or experiences. There's been a theme asking questions about technologies that help people with disabilities, for example, people with dementia, to have an intimate bond. So what would either of you say about the kinds of technologies, either for care or for intimacy, potentially even sexual, that are developed to have relations of any kind with someone with dementia who may not even realize that they're not interacting with a real person, whether it's, I can think of the range from, petting the robotic cat or the seal, right, that we've all seen, to having some kind of sexual contact with a doll or a robot.
Dementia is a really tricky and difficult case, and one where I don't think that if there's a chance that someone is going to be taken into to the point of delusion, I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think we should ever be at the point of delusion with this technology, and this is being really well researched. I know that Noel and Amanda Sharkey have written at length about this, about robots and working with patients with dementia. So I think that's a really problematic thing, because at the point of dementia where people cannot differentiate satisfactorily between what is real and what is not, then we should not be introducing technology that confuses that further.
And there we go, Kate. We agree on something, but maybe for different reasons. Because I would say, if you think about who the roboticists and the AI people have targeted, they've targeted the vulnerable populations, populations that themselves do not have political voices in society. They may not have a lot of economic resources. And so therefore they can be the egocentric voice, can't they? They can narrate about the other's experience from their own point of view. And I saw this myself when I studied the therapeutic use of robots for children with autism. And they were actually making claims that I think went beyond what was actually happening, making claims about the kind of magic capabilities of robots to treat autism. But I certainly think, you know, let's think about what is robotics and AI. And the Marxists got this right. And I would definitely put myself in as a classical Marxist approach. You know, it's about the systematic deduction of labor through mechanization. So they've done all these studies with Alzheimer's, and they've found that art is really great for people with Alzheimer's. In fact, I think you have a wonderful experiment in the Netherlands, an Alzheimer's village where, you know, music's played, dance is also very good. The problem with all these things is they require resources for a population that's not creating an income, right? They're not working, they're not part of the income generating population. These are the populations that are being targeted. Sometimes in order to help society, we need a human solution. Actually, music, theatre, dance, drama, all these wonderful things could be engaging disabled, people with disabilities, people who have, cognitive decline over time. These could be solutions, but they're not the solutions that are being identified and chosen in a capitalist society that wants to continually reduce labour, especially in areas where there's no profit to be made.
So you would see the use of something like a care robot as fitting into that same pattern as a way of eliminating humans and giving it the problem to technology because it's a cheaper way of handling it, basically.
Well, yeah, and I don't think there's any such thing as a care robot. Care is only something you can give and receive at approximate level. I mean, you can have it echoed like Kate was talking about earlier. I mean, I have relationships, if you like, with people I've never met in person, but I hope to meet them in person one day. So it is possible, but are they the same relationships as someone in your own life? That's slightly different. But yes, I think that I read a really interesting proposal the other day about developing some robots, and it was all about how these robots were going to change the economy. But what I found really interesting is there was no mention of the economy that they were actually going to change. What there was it seemed like an army of middle managers in robotics and AI who would, be these intermediaries between the workforce and like the companies. And ultimately it's about reducing labor on the one hand, but creating it in other areas, in these like professional, I mean, the industry of professional ethicists of robotics and AI. I mean, I guess we're all a part of it in a way, but it's a huge industry now because it's had resources directed to it. No resources for art clubs if you've got Alzheimer's, I'm afraid, or very little.
So this is a follow-up comment and question, I think. Someone in the chat wrote, my uncle with dementia has a very strong bond with an old bear doll. Is that a problem? And would it become a problem if that doll had the capability to satisfy his sexual needs, which he expressed?
That's a good question. I guess if it's not trying to delude, if you're not going to be deluded in any way that this is a human, I wonder, is that where the line is drawn for me? I think that's a good question, and I'm not sure.
I think if your uncle wants to rub the bear on his genitals, the bear's not going to be harmed and you're not likely to be harmed. However, if you start thinking the bear can come to life and be your friend, then I think maybe you should probably go and join a social club.
But this is someone with dementia, right? So perhaps he's...
I think as well, I mean, these kind of questions, I wonder who asked that question, whether it was designed to be deliberately provocative. At the end of the day, a person has needs, they're very complex, and it's kind of like, I'm not an incel, so I don't believe that there should be forced sex, that women owe men sex, and nor do I think that it's the only activity that's meaningful to us as human beings. There are other forms of contact and care and touch that you can receive in other kinds of ways, but everything kind of gets reduced to sex in our culture because it's dominated by a patriarchal worldview, a capitalist economy of patriarchy and subordination.
Thank you. Well, we have a couple of questions that are very popular in the chat, which maybe are going to be contentious again. But so someone asked about the correlation between abuse and rape and the use of porn dolls. Is there actually any evidence for this correlation? Moreover, is there evidence of causation?
No, not in my research.
Okay. And Kathleen, did you want to respond?
Well, I want you to think about the pots in ancient Greece again, right? Were those pots just a split off imaginary world, or were they actually representing what those men did in that society? Were they actually copying reproductions of the actual activity that was taking place? And we know from the vast amounts of pornography that exist in our world, and particularly even around the child abuse porn dolls, we know that nearly every case of someone found with a child abuse porn doll, and I would say 100% of the cases, but you can never be sure 100% of the time, are found with abuse imagery of children, real live children. We're talking about infants in category A being raped and tortured, animals being tortured and raped. So this is not a hypothetical thing. We're finding people with these objects. People who don't tend to want to rape children don't tend to want to have anatomically correct porn dolls of children, right? It's not something that they want. So the objects that are kind of, it's a bit like the porn on the pots. The objects that are distributed or developed become they reflect back, don't they, the worldview, the kind of pornographic worldview that started to dominate our world.
But you're talking about a very niche part of this with the childlike sex dolls, which is illegal, and which nobody wants to see. But the question was more broadly about sex dolls, was it?
It was about
rape and
child dolls.
Yeah.
Oh, child dolls, was it? Okay. Yeah.
So maybe we have so many more questions, but we only have time for one more. And I think it's a nice broad one. So for both of you, is intimacy in the eye of the beholder? In other words, what counts as evidence for having an experience of intimacy or intimacy existing between, of course, could be between two people, but here obviously we're also talking about between a person and an object. What counts as sufficient evidence?
In my mind, yes, intimacy is in the eye of the beholder. If someone tells me that they feel as if they are in an intimate relationship with something or someone, then who am I to disregard those feelings? It is entirely in the eye of the beholder, in my opinion.
I think you can have feelings inside yourself and thoughts inside yourself, but when they're in regard to a relationship, then there is another party. So there is another. In fact, we don't exist outside another. So we tend to look at things like love and sex from an adult point of view, but certainly love. But let's end on love because it's really important. I know it's one of Lily's top topics here. Lily's written about the symposium where basically men have, if you know historically what symposiums were, they were like the slavers who would rape a few slaves and then they would have this big conversation afterwards. And in that book, there's no mention, for example, of mother love. There's no mention of this kind of attachment to a mother figure. And when we're born, we come into the world with extraordinary vulnerability. We can't meet our own needs. We can't feed ourselves. We can't clothe ourselves. Through our strong bond and our love for our carer, it could be the mother, but it's better if there's like a small community around the child who helps the child to meet their own needs. And it's that child who becomes an adult. So if the child hasn't had that good experience of some kind of relational experience, that it's give and take, that it's sharing, that it's that kind of intimacy, you know, and unfortunately in our world, a lot of people don't. They can grow up with very disordered ideas of attachment. And in those situations, you know, sometimes the kind of ideas you might have an adult might actually be harmful to other people. There's one thing, unrequited love, if it's something you feel internally and you don't express. It's another thing if you're constantly contacting the person who you think you love and they're not responding to you. So I think everything is depending on the people involved. And once again, nobody can have a relationship with an object. It's not possible. It's not participating in anything. That's an egocentric, annihilating worldview, which I don't want to live in that world. And unfortunately, that's the world we are living in.
Thank you. And I think we need to stop there. We're out of time. So I want to thank you both so much, Dr. Devlin and Professor Richardson, and thank you to our audience and to the organizers. I want to remind everyone that Studium Generale has an event this week on cyborgs as part of the Dutch Technology Week. So check out their website. And if we could please give our speakers a virtual round of applause for this extremely engaging conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. I believe that's it. So thanks again and take care. Have a great night.